I'm primarily a hypnotist. I train therapists and practitioners to coach the unconscious mind, to help people to access the deeper resources that they have, basically to learn how to change unconscious patterns, right? Patterns of thought, patterns of feeling, patterns of being, patterns of doing, right? These are the things at play. Most people don't understand how unconscious we are. You know, that 97, 98% of all of our processing is outside of our conscious awareness. Pretty much functioning on autopilot most of the day, and that these habits are deeply ingrained and we don't even recognize them as habits, even habits of perception, habits of our point of view. That's primarily my work. I'm known for kind of bridging the gap between science, neuroscience, and cognitive sciences and therapeutic work, so that a lot of what I do, what I teach is practical neuroscience.
It's interesting because I want to reinforce for everyone that listens anything we talk about on this show, any changes, any habits, any wellness advice, everything underpinning it is the work that you're doing. Because if we're not cognizant of what our behavior is, if we don't recognize where our awareness is going, you can have the best intentions in the world, but a lot of these things you're trying to change won't happen. And you mentioned the gap that you see. Can you talk a little bit about the gap that you're bridging? Because I'm so curious about that. I see that in the way that you write posts, the way you convey information, but just to give a little bit more detail and color for that.
When I first started college, I was a psychology major and then quickly shifted. And that was because what I was looking at just didn't, it was so outdated. It just wasn't up to date with what we knew even then. And that was, a long time ago. I'm 57 years old. So we're talking about way, I was out to date then. What they're still teaching and the therapist that I train is no longer relevant as to what we now know about the adaptive unconscious, not the old Freudian unconscious, but the fact that you are multi processing thought, embodied sensation, millions of bits of information you are processing every moment. You can be conscious of about 40 of those in any given moment. For me, it's about taking the current research and then designing either hypnotic or therapeutic interventions that take into account that this is how the brain changes. This is what we know about psychological priming and how we're constantly priming ourselves in our through our environment, internally and externally. How do we use this information? How do we take what is being done in a laboratory and make use of it? How do we make our lives easier to understanding the natural tendencies of our nervous system, the natural tendencies of our mind? And so that's kind of the gap that I try to bridge. People will tell you what they need to eat, what they need to do in order to get to where they want to be, as if that were enough, right? But we know the best intentions. All right, Monday, I'm going to start that diet. All right, Monday, I'm going to, wake up and write. At Monday, and it's always Monday, and we have these great intentions, but the truth is, you're going up against 98% of you that has been trained through habituation, right? I always say your brain runs on prediction because that's how it functions. It can only feel how you've felt. It can only be how you've been because that's how your brain learns and functions and moves forward. So we need to learn how to widen out the pool of possibilities that the prediction, part of the brain can pull from.
What you're saying, it resonates a lot when you think about the Monday, for example. The Monday, I'm gonna go do this new, totally different habit that I've been trying to do for a decade, and it's not working, and I don't understand. And maybe it's just the wrong trend or strategy. But when you talk about how, well, you're going up against such a big percentage of the way that you have habituated, the way that you have lived, the way that you see the world. I think you even talked about this habit of perspective that we don't even realize is a habit. How do you start to bring some awareness to these things so that you can start to shift them? Because what you said that stuck with me is you can only be who you've been. If you don't see or feel yourself in a different state, how can you shift? Like, that's a resource that isn't naturally already there. And so I don't know if you have, I know you share a lot of examples on Instagram, for example, and it's very helpful. So if you have one of something that people get stuck in.
For instance, if your listeners wanted to learn a few different ways to rapidly go into self-hypnosis, which I strongly suggest everybody know. And if you go to melissatiers.com, just click on the free classes and you'll find a whole suite of them so that you don't need to pay for it. Take just 3 minutes out of your day to envision, imagine yourself doing this new behavior. Now, when it's done with a little dose of hypnosis, with a little dose of trance, and all hypnosis really is a state where you're more open to suggestion. So if I wanted to start a new habit on Monday, maybe that's of exercising, getting on the yoga mat. I would start by dipping in a little bit to where I'm more open and suggestible. And then I would see myself on the yoga mat in the morning. And I would take a few minutes to envision that, to then, as I'm envisioning it, imagine floating into this envision so I can embody it. My brain is actually firing off as if I were really doing yoga. That's the beautiful thing about fMRI machines, brain scans, where we can see the brain in action. Just imagining doing it, you're actually rehearsing it neurologically, which means if your brain runs on prediction, you've now given it a way to pull from that experience to know how to respond on Monday. Right? So that's one aspect. Going into trance and envisioning writing every morning, sitting at the desk and writing every morning, or painting, or doing, or being productive, or making those calls, whatever this new goal you have, envision yourself doing it, not the end result, which is unfortunately what too many people are taught. You can imagine the end result if it will give you the emotional hit. So we can milk the future emotional state in order to paste it on the activity tomorrow. But too often people are just taught to envision the goal done. And that actually has been shown in quite a few studies to be counterproductive. But
Mm.
if you envision it being done in order to feel how good it feels, and then you imagine stepping on the yoga mat, that's when you're using it to really move forward in a way that is embodied. The other thing is to understand a little bit about priming. So I have my yoga mat. I have to step over it to get to my couch.
Brilliant idea. I hope everyone's listening.
Psychologically prime myself, which is another fascinating rabbit hole we can dive down, right? Like you're sitting, if you're listening to this and you're sitting on a softer chair, then your mind will be more easily open to and malleable. If you're sitting on a hard chair, it'll be harder for you to change your mind.
The priming you're talking about is more somatic and tactile in this part, or there are other elements to it too?
Many elements. So there's what are you visually seeing? You had mentioned the plants, and before recording, we had talked about, the different ways that I have learned to be able to have all of these healthy plants behind me. The reason I have them behind me while I'm doing sessions, while I'm teaching, is because just looking at plants primes you for not only
Mm.
creativity, but also will prime your immune system. Now, there's been studies where if you can walk every day in nature, it not only boosts creativity, but it boosts your health for many markers. Interleukins get produced that fight cancer. If you cannot walk in nature, then the best thing to do would be to have a window where you can see nature. If you cannot do that, then the best thing to do is to bring in nature, have plants. If you cannot do that, then even seeing pictures of nature and green plants. So many hospitals now will have forests in their artwork because it's been shown to boost the immune system. So that's one way of visually priming. There's studies done. There's a book called Drunk Tank Pink, and it takes its name from this color of pink that when painted on the walls, if you take someone who is drunk or violent and put them in a pink room, this particular pink, it'll act as a sedative. So we are being primed every single moment by the colors on the walls, by, what we're sitting on, by the clothes we're wearing or the clothes that someone else is wearing. We have all of these cognitive filters that are going on outside of our conscious awareness. If you're listening to this and you're holding a warm cup of coffee, then you'll rate me as being, a warmer individual. You might not use the term warmer, but you might. We're welcoming. If you're holding an iced coffee, then I have to work a little harder. And I always say that because it's kind of fascinating to think of why. Why is that true? So in my classes, I teach this because I teach coaching the unconscious mind, right? When you're born, it's all somatic. It's early sensory experience that gets in first to our neurology. It builds a foundation. And what is warm? Warm is being nurtured and held and loved and fed. Cold is the opposite. So very early on, we start to build an awareness. Warm is good, cold is bad. So much so that those early learnings are still with us. We start with sensory experience and then we move to the level of abstraction. So we can say, I'm warming up to this idea. What a warm hearted person, or don't give me the cold shoulder. What a cold bitch. So we are primed by our past. We have neural associations that predispose us to feel or think a certain way based on how we've felt and thought. So when I work with people, I'm teaching them first a level that I call it self-directed neuroplasticity. And it just means that you can learn how to change your brain. And I teach a bunch of different, very rapid ways for people to get out of an unwanted state, whether it's being able to stop a craving, stop anxiety, stop the stress, stop the compulsivity dead in its tracks, but using that stopping of it to start building new neural pathways. Then I work with them to see where they get triggered. And I neutralize that triggering feeling and then condition in how they want to feel. That's the second layer. But the third layer is equally as important, which is an understanding of the why. Why? Why haven't I been able to change this? Without the understanding of why and what purpose it has served, then they don't get the full congruent change.
There's so much information here that could be completely difficult to understand, and I know that you have terms that you could make at that next level because you're working with practitioners, but I appreciate you bringing it down to examples that people can really understand.
When I read this book years ago about how good it was to walk in nature every morning, I started that habit. I also know how vital it is to wake up early in the morning and get the earliest sunshine in my eyes. Now, I'm an ex rock and roll musician, right? So waking up to see the sunrise didn't used to be my habit. I started to wake up early, go for a walk as early as I could see the sunrise, maybe not the sunrise, but the earliest sunshine I can get into my eyeballs. That starts the neurochemistry. That starts all the good chemicals going in your brain. That's another great tip for people. And one thing I didn't know is if you can also get out there and get the sun setting, that light into your eyeballs, it starts the melatonin and it really resets your circadian clock.
Musicians, hypnotherapy, I think that's an interesting aspect of showing like how much things can change in our reality and what we do.
I was always obsessed with altered states of consciousness from, my very young life of spinning and being 9 years old, obsessed with like spinning and hyperventilating just so I can get that one moment of weirdness. And then drugs and psychedelic drugs. I was a very early user of those because I was fascinated by altered states of consciousness. So that's something that has been consistent my whole life. Then I became far more interested after a certain psychedelic trip on how the hell it was possible to change perception so drastically. And I started to study what was going on in the brain. Then I started to get curious. How can we have some of these effects without the drugs? Still a rock and roll musician, but then I started to be that weird rock and roll musician who was hypnotizing people in the back of CBGBs, um, I had zero intention of doing it for a living. It was, when I got pregnant and decided my days of like, stomping around in combat boots on a stage maybe were behind me now. It's not true for everybody, but I was really getting more and more fascinated, not just the malleability of mind, but how can we change the mind faster?
You made this very interesting shift from doing one thing to doing another, but it makes sense when you describe it. And I'm wondering for people listening that I know they have the point A, point B they want to be at if we keep it super simple like that. What do you think are some of the you use this term and I don't wanna misuse it, so if I am, please correct me. But this idea of, like, the pattern interrupt, the idea of we're thinking one way that is making us continue down a certain action or certain habit cycle. And I know that you give examples of that. How do we begin to introduce that? And I realize that's a big question, so if you want me to give, like, a specific example, I can do that, or if you've got one too.
We have these habit roads, right? If you can imagine it as a pathway, right, that we've gone down so many times that no grass grows there. It's easy to walk down when we're not thinking, right? It's a path that's so wide, we don't need to think consciously in order to find ourselves already walking down it. So the first thing we have to do is when we start to feel ourselves feeling that feeling that starts us down the road, or even if we find ourselves already walking down the road, is to put a roadblock up. And the roadblock is the pattern interrupt. That's all the techniques. Again, I have a free class where you can learn a bunch of these techniques. I also have them on Instagram, out of anxiety, out of craving, out of even that hesitation, that procrastination. And once you start down that road and you put that roadblock up, that forces the brain to create a different path, to make a new road, a side path that if you continue to walk down that new road, you will widen it out and it can become just as habituated, just as automated as the old road. So the pattern interrupts are designed to get you the hell out of an unwanted state and to put up the roadblock so that you detour in a better way.
What would be kind of a roadblock example with that? If we're talking about procrastination where it's not the case to wait for more information. It is the case that you feel that you have what you need, but something else is going on there. What would be a pattern interrupt that you could introduce to start to go around or beyond that?
One is what we talked about earlier, which is priming ourselves for doing the thing, right? Whether we're using the self hypnosis to envision ourselves doing it, whether we have to go to the end result in order to feel how good it feels to get it done. Because those are the things we typically procrastinate on, right? The shit we don't necessarily get so excited about doing, right? So I imagine this task done. It feels so good to imagine it done that then I envision myself starting it. So that the same approach that we talked about earlier applies. If procrastination for you is an impulse to do something other than what you say you're going to do, like let's say you sit down to write and instead you check Instagram or you see your email app or notification. So in that moment where you feel that pull towards something else, Here's a good one that I'll leave everyone with. Find a focal point right now, stare at it without moving your eyes, shift out into your peripheral vision. Without moving your eyes, become aware of the walls on either side of you, as if you can be aware of beyond the walls, expanding into your peripheral vision, almost as if you could be aware of all that space behind you. Then you bring it back into focus and you start to do the thing. So that's a pattern interrupt that has a few interesting features. Some of you might have noticed a relaxation because shifting into peripheral vision introduces, or rather switches you into the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the relaxation response. But it also does another cool thing. It tends to stop internal dialogue. So for me, it's like pressing a pause button. For my own personal self, I call it shifting out and shutting up. Now, if I'm using it because I'm being triggered with, let's say, a craving or anxiety or some other triggering negative feeling, I shift out, shut up, stop the inner dialogue that's keeping that cycle going because you only have 90 seconds. 90 seconds for that negative emotional wash to wash through the system. But we're so good at keeping it going longer through internal dialogue. When we come back in, we ask ourselves one simple question: what's not that? Because if I'm anxious and I say to myself, what's everything I'm not noticing that's not that? It immediately takes consciousness, inductive, or rather, to everything that's not that, which is such a wide state that your left brain can't answer a question like that because left brain is very linear, sequential. It would take forever to start to label everything you're not noticing that's not that in the universe. So what happens is it shuts the left brain up for a moment and right brain comes online because your right brain is global. It processes simultaneously. And what that does is it interrupts the strategy in a really good way because it takes me from hyper focused on anxiety or craving or whatever negative feeling and widens it out. It shuts me up for just a moment and allows me to think more openly. Your boss triggers you in that moment. And what's happening is your unconscious mind is trying to get you to run away because it senses a threat. But you can't run away from your boss. You can shift into peripheral vision, stop the internal dialogue, get centered, come back in with your answer. But that takes practice to not look stoned.
I'm just imagining it's gonna become a trend on social media, all these people looking completely out of it because they're using this technique. But I love it, thank you, that it's very helpful, and I could already just when I was doing it with you, I could recognize how inner dialogue was silenced and attention just went elsewhere, and I don't do you know that book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain? Have you followed that?
I had it in my library.
It's a great book though because it's doing what you are saying where it has techniques where you silence the left side of your brain so that you can draw for those people who think they can't. And you'll do things like you'll draw an image upside down and your left brain doesn't know how to process that. So you get away from the inner talk of this is the symbol for this. This is the perspective I use. And it's fascinating how good even the worst artist, I'm speaking about even myself here, can do from this strategy. So I can just imagine applying it in the ways that you've talked about, how much that can add to your life. I could talk to you for a lot longer, Melissa, but I can't for this episode. So I need to ask you've mentioned a few really great resources, which we'll link up, but if you can also share where people can connect with you, how they can work with you if they can, both practitioners and non, actually, because I think there will be some practitioners who might be intrigued.
If you go to melissatiers.com, more information about me, what classes I'm running, you can sign up for my waiting list if you want to work with me personally. You can see a directory of a bunch of amazing practitioners that I've trained that are all over the world. That's where the free classes are. Sign up for my mailing list.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for everything you've done. I know this is a drop of all the knowledge, but already feel like it's some things that people can implement. And honestly, that's the best that you can give. Thank you so much.
Sure, my pleasure. My pleasure.